Hello and welcome to another edition of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Raybush. With me, as always, is Phil Mackenzie. And Phil, I just wanted to tell you, first of all, I'm very excited for this week's episode. Though not as excited as I could be. Because, we're going to get into these matchups. Second of all, I just struck my head. I was walking through the doorway. I was so excited I leapt up and hit my head really hard on the doorframe. But anyway, having gotten that out of the way, I'm really excited to break down UFC 273 with you. 2 title fights. Both of which I think are going to have a dynamic that are, maybe there's not a lot to say is the problem, right? But they are still very compelling fights. Do you agree?
I think there's just like a directionality to them that is very difficult to avoid, but they are still.
Is this gonna be your response if I come in with a sudden bout of amnesia? Is just to play along?
I'm just gonna run everything past you again.
You have the taking it easy at work, the hardly working strategy to this podcast. Wow.
I just want to see how often I can trap you in to Groundhog Day.
Not today, motherfucker. That's all I have to say. I'm well aware.
Memento, I can't be the Teddy to your main character in Memento. Just get you to try and fulfill the same task over and over again.
Yeah. Well, last week we jumped the gun. We talked about UFC 270.
I think what you mean is that we beat the crowd.
That's right. We're actually trend setting, as it says, I believe, in one of the breaks between segments.
Everyone else put all their analysis out this week, whereas we were the first.
Yeah.
Anyone looking for breakdowns early, they knew where to look. Heavy Hands. Prescient.
That's right.
Yeah, out front. And it wasn't a stupid mistake made by us.
Yeah, we didn't at the end of that same episode say, like, oh, there's actually a week off after this, where we realized that the following card, the Muhammad Luque one, was in 3 weeks, but not that UFC 273 was in 2 weeks. I'm saying that didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't happen. So if you want to hear us talk about Volkanovski, Korean Zombie, and Sterling Yan 2, go back and listen to that episode, but not that last part where we sound like idiots. Don't listen to that part.
Go edit it, Connor. Shit.
I'm not going to do that. I'm simply not. For this week, therefore, while continually reminding you to go check out last week's episode, because, it's, I think, more or less the episode we would have released this week anyway, we're going to try to get us into some topics. I think we may also touch on one more UFC 273 fight that we did not have time for last week, that being
Rosenstruik.
That's right. Jairzinho Rosenstruik versus Martin Simur. No, I think we're going to talk about Mackenzie Dern, Tisha Torres, because it's kind of interesting. It's meaningful, and by God, we need to fill airtime. But we thought we might do more of a topical episode. A rare chance to do a topical episode, which really last week should have been our rare chance, but whatever. What's the difference? Why are you all looking at me like I did something wrong? Right, Phil?
Because, well, yeah, why are they looking at you? I'll defend you this once. It was him. It was his fault.
Thanks, buddy. Thank God my headphones are turned very low, so if there was anything else you said there, I did not hear it. Our topic for this week, therefore, is we're going to try to take a very generalist view at MMA development, both in the past in the recent past and going forward. MMA is famously, no sport talks about its age more than MMA. MMA is famously a young game, a game that is constantly developing and changing, that is yet to have this feeling of where like certain rules and ideas are necessarily set in stone. Every 3 years, some bozo realizes that he can like do the MMA equivalent of smashing the square button over and over, and actually like 70% of his opponents don't know what to do about it. And so then we see a new trend of some very specific technique. The point is, it's a sport liable to change, which it has already done many times over the course of its history. And we want to talk about where we think it's headed and what is indicated by some of the shifts that we have seen pretty recently. Metagame, Phil. That's the word I'm looking for. Metagame.
Yep.
So
where it's come from and where it's going.
So where do we start? We've got a couple of sort of areas to delve into here.
I mean, do we want to start at the beginning, close to the beginning?
Sure. Are we talking about sort of the metagame development, the stylistic development? Because there are other aspects, I think, to this discussion to be had. There's, who knows, maybe it won't be organized at all and we'll just continually branch out in different directions. But we're also going to talk about, how the sort of national and ethnic makeup of the major rosters in the sport, how it's become so much more international. We're going to talk about sort of the development of like physical focus of the actual athlete side of things in MMA, which is a big deal and has just become increasingly more so over the course of the sport's history. And we're going to talk about sort of the style changes, metagame changes as well. Do we want to start with more of a stylistic approach and see where we go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because that allows us to sort of set the frame. And, we've discussed this a few times, and I think, many other people have as well, that the process of developing in MMA has been sort of along the lines of whatever is effective gets developed. Whatever's the most effective, unsurprisingly, gets developed first, and then that in turn gets overtaken by by sort of what comes next. So, at the beginning, which is where everything was essentially broadly a street fight, everything revolves around the idea that both people are going to fall into the clinch and roll around, because I think this is really key to how fighting goes in general with people who aren't trained, and sort of very few people were trained back in the early days of the UFC and back in the early days of the UFC. One of the things which I always find was actually illustrative of this was watching Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier getting into a fight on a talk show.
When boxers get into tussles outside the boxing ring.
Yeah,
and suddenly
because
they're
you
wrestling.
You would be like if Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier got into a fight, bare knuckle fight outside the ring. It would be awesome, and it would look like trained fighters going at it. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't. They just roll around on the floor looking like idiots. And that was really what the early UFCs were about. They were about exploiting people rolling around on the floor like idiots, and they worked super well.
I think that is both a natural thing, right? Like, I think even for really good boxers, you don't necessarily want to get hit in the face or break your hand on the other guy's face. So that might be a motivation to tie up. With early UFC, I would pin it more on nobody was a comfortable striker. The few people that were comfortable strikers, like Art Jimerson, who is, a good boxer, by the way, who has become immortalized in the memory of MMA fans as the guy with one boxing glove. But if you were a good striker like Art Jimerson, then you were so anxious about everything else that might happen that you couldn't get any strikes off. And what happens when you're super uncomfortable on the feet is you don't control range or distance. You have to reach and you overthrow and you crash into your opponent. And we still see plenty of this. Fighters who do not know how to maintain their distance while striking and just incidentally clinch. We see lots of it in boxing even. It happens tons where people overthrow and crash into their opponent and tie up. So yeah.
It's just an incredibly difficult thing to do.
Yeah,
to be able
it's a natural thing to happen in a fist fight, and it's particularly easy to fall into when you're not as good at striking.
Yeah, of the many things that people have been trained to do, it's not. I don't really think we're actually that well optimized to be able to predict where another person is going to be based on tiny little movements that they do, and to punch them as they're doing it.
Yeah,
it's something that has to be learned. It's actually very challenging.
Much better done from a safe distance with a spear. That comes more naturally to us. So yeah, grappling, people involving themselves in grappling that they didn't actually want to be doing. That was the first thing to exploit.
Yep. And sort of everyone pretty much learned how to grapple in some kind of way. It started to favor the strongest and most athletic grapplers rather than necessarily the most practiced ones.
Yeah.
Then we got the first rise of sprawl and brawl. The first people who could stop takedowns and then strike.
Yeah.
It became suddenly about being able to strike on the feet. And then since then it's sort of been a bit of a seesaw between, because after the sprawl and brawlers we got things like the sort of GSP style phase shifters. But then the style archetypes started to branch out. The more pure wrestler types built out better ways of getting people to the ground. So but basically, there's been something of a back and forth. And I think one of the things that at least I've been wrong on, and has been that I thought that striking would predominate more than it has.
Yeah.
Heavy hands has always been a pretty striking, biased
absolutely
show.
It's the least gay type of fighting. That's
Exactly.
always been our stance.
Yep.
And we'll stand by it.
We'll
stand by it, okay? Not sit on the fucking floor. Go on, Phil.
Yeah. I still do wonder what it would have been like if you'd stuck with that as the original tagline of the show. If you came here, the least gay part of MMA, you came to the right place.
Bye. Yeah.
So some of the reasons why we thought striking was kind of going to rise to the forefront is that it takes a lot of effort to get a takedown. You have to implement multiple phases. You have to get your penetration step right. You have to make a good connection. It takes a lot of effort, and it doesn't do any damage in and of itself. Whereas things like jabs, for example, are very easy to land, and they are rewards in and of themselves.
Yep, super low investment.
Yeah, it seems kind of natural to assume it would be. It seems kind of natural that you would that we just thought it would move sort of further in this probabilistic direction, but there's also that still does miss the. Probably, I think has definitely kind of missed the point that wrestling is incredibly valuable if it works.
Yeah. Yeah, we already. I have said for many years, and will continue to say that for the rest of the time I'm watching this sport, I assume that wrestling is it's the crux. Mm-hmm. Wrestling is the base skill set for MMA because it is the one which allows you to dictate where the fight takes place. And I think my tacit assumption for quite a while was that meant that people would just be using it more defensively. Yes. And so, yeah, it's still immensely important not to get taken down. But once you got that, what I think I ignored is what you just said, that the rewards of getting a takedown are so much higher than a takedown is. Maybe this should influence scoring, by the way, since we've been having so many open scoring discussions and shit. Maybe takedowns should be regarded more highly in scoring. Or maybe they're just their own reward. But as their own reward, they are the most valuable thing after a knockout. You know? In the absence of instantly finishing your opponent, a takedown is the best thing you can do in a fight.
Pretty much. Because they just put the opponent into a situation where they have to make generally, assuming it's we're talking an actual successful takedown in the purest sense. Someone's shoulders hit the mat, they are controlled on the mat for some period of time.
Yeah.
This puts the opponent in a position where they have to make multiple often very dangerous guesses to get out. And
if we've seen how much
they don't, they have simply given away an entire round.
Right. And if we've talked about how important pressure and volume striking have become, and they continue to be important, but there's no kind of pressure more meaningful than just taking someone down and staying on top of them. That is pure uncut initiative. They have to do things in response to what you're doing. They can't really get off ideas of their own without dealing with the problem, literally staring them in the face.
Uh-huh.
Unless
and also, as you mentioned,
it's
a safety blanket if you are being pressured yourself.
Yeah.
And your sense of distance might be going. Being able to shoot a takedown is super valuable. Just being pushed back and being able to hit a counter double leg onto someone who is pressing forward on you is super valuable.
Yeah.
If everyone has to, if we were talking as we did about a dynamic where pressure was really what was defining a lot of the metagame, what happens when two people both step forward at the same time?
Right.
You end up in the clinch.
Yeah. Yeah, and what you were getting at before is a thing I've also talked about a lot. Famously, when I was like, maybe Holly Holm should take Ronda Rousey down. And I was like, this is a stupid thing to say. And then she did it. And it kind of worked the way I thought it might.
Yeah.
Is that...
really, it made Ronda Rousey even more mad and panicked than she even was.
and beyond that, it came at a moment when Holly Holm was basically the only time in the fight when she was at danger of succumbing to Ronda Rousey's just intense pressure on the feet. Mm-hmm. And she's like, oh, quickly, instinctively almost change levels like that Welsh Taco Bell worker. Did you see that one?
No, I haven't yet. Is it good?
Yeah, some guy is being dragged out of the place. They're clearly drunk by his buddy, and then he rushes back in. He knocks something off a table, and he runs up and takes a swing. And the Welsh Taco Bell man just ducks it. The guy basically falls himself into a double leg, and then he lifts him up and drops him on his head, and he gets knocked out.
Sweet.
But that's the thing, right? Somebody crashes into you. It makes perfect sense to create that collision on your own terms. That is a very, very important thing, whether you're in an exclusively striking sport like boxing or kickboxing. Grappling is still an important thing. It's important to be able to initiate some grappling. Otherwise, you will never get away with being on the back foot and actually winning a fight. You have to be able to control that and initiate it on your own terms.
And I think one of the developments that we've seen in the sport, which I guess we can link to a few other things, is that So I guess back when both of us first started really like seriously following MMA, that was sort of coming at the tail end of the idea that like generically well-rounded MMA fighters were going to run the sport.
Yeah.
Just going to be good at everything. And then but you know what we actually saw was primarily people getting some kind of skill backing in all the general areas of MMA, but we saw much more specialist fighters. You know, people who really were like primarily kickboxers, primarily grapplers, and so on. Your Khabibs, your Max Holloways, so on and so forth. What I think we see now is actually getting closer to what people thought of back in, you know, that debunked era of like the specialist. We are seeing much more like, I guess, sort of generically well-rounded, very good prospects who are just, you know, the idea of the MMA native and so on, who are just pretty good at everything.
Yeah. It turns out after 20 years that Joe Rogan was right.
Yep. Yeah, it was later than people thought. But,
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
So, I mean, what we did, one of the things that we did for this was we just had a look at we had a look at all the major, essentially the men's divisions, and because they've been around for longer and you can trace these things a little better through them, and just had a look at, you know, who are the actual young fighters in those divisions who are, you know, really on the come up, and what do they sort of look like? What are the commonalities between the ones who are, you know, 30 and under, and who seriously look like they might be a presence in the division for some time?
Yeah.
And I mean, and we found something, and, you know, we found some really, at least one incredibly interesting fact out. Julian Paiva is 26 years old.
Julian Paiva is 26. He's a young man.
It just doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense at all. It's wrong.
I don't get it.
It has to be an error.
Is he the oldest young man in, like, he's one of the oldest young men in UFC history?
He's not a young man. I just don't believe it. He's 35. I'm sorry.
When Brazilian Cowboy came to the UFC, I think he was up there.
Absolutely.
He was 26, and he looked exactly the same.
An incredibly old young man.
Yeah. He was around 26.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jesus.
Yeah. Julian Paiva in his geriatric prime. Yeah. No, but what we actually noticed, aside from Julian Paiva's astounding youth, was that there's sort of in almost every division except arguably bantamweight, which is still this is the main reason, by the way, guys. If you've been wondering about, like, you've been trying to, like, pin down, ooh, Conor's got biases, I'm going to catch him, he's the only guy with biases. And you're like, he hates all the Dagestani guys. He hates Russians. No, wait. He hates Muslims. And then you're like, oh, he thinks bantamweight's the best division. He hates X thing. I just like strikers. That's why we say bantamweight's the best division. That's it. Because it's got all the strikers. They all knock each other out and shit. It rules. It's the coolest thing to look at. Aside from bantamweight, many of the divisions, up and comers, are quite well rounded, where often it's difficult to really pin down what their main thing is. They might lean 60-40 in one direction or the other, But yeah, you look at a guy like Bryce Mitchell. What is Bryce Mitchell's core phase? It's grappling. But Bryce Mitchell is tremendously well-rounded and loves striking with people and does it quite well. You look at Jack Shore, just got the best win of his career a couple weeks ago. What is Jack Shore's core phase? I mean, it's
probably wrestling, but he won that. His best win was basically on the feet.
Like, it's kind of wrestling, but it's kind of not wrestling anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That's now just sort of blended into the fullness of his game. Who else?
I mean, I think that division just in and of itself, it has this. It represents a good Venn diagram.
Yeah,
because it has like Arnold Allen at the other end.
Featherweight, you mean?
Basically, he's basically a striker.
Yeah.
But he's also like quite an adept and willing grappler as well.
Mm-hmm. Mads Burnell, who famously fought Allen, who I'd like to see back someday. He's another young guy who's still improving. Does everything. Mm-hmm. Quite good at everything, in fact.
Ivleev, again, like primarily a grappler. And again, featherweight in particular has always been a real strikers division. But you're getting more people who are even weighted more towards being grapplers.
Yeah.
Or at least not even just necessarily grapplers, but wrestlers. Ortega was quite highly touted when he came in, but this was primarily because he just seemed to be able to submit everyone.
Yeah, and now he's just a striker who
control
can't.
Wrestlers. Sorry, what's that?
Now he's just a striker who can't take people down.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much.
Yes. In general, we're seeing across most of the divisions, the young prospects are a much more blended mix than they ever used to be, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think we have actually, without even realizing it, been experiencing the first real era of the MMA native being like a ubiquitous thing. And I think that's a multifaceted development. We may as well bring in some of our other areas outside of just what our fighters doing in the cage here to try to explain why we see so many MMA natives.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, there is just it's sort of like MMA it's just like disseminating itself. This is what happens. This is what happened in boxing, certainly. That once you started to have a sort of an unwritten code of all the things you need to know to be a good fighter, it becomes easier and easier to sort of spread the basic package of MMA skills to other areas, and MMA has undoubtedly become more and more international. I think that is a big element of it. It's worth noting that a guy like Jack Shore, who's was at least previously a real grappling specialist, who's now become super well rounded, is like a great wrestler from the UK. There are, in fact, quite a few quality wrestlers from the UK. Mark Jacasey won a fight the other weekend with just wrestling, pretty much. This was not the case 10 years ago. It was a running gag that British people couldn't wrestle 10 years ago. And I don't think you can really make that joke anymore. I think Michael Bisping actually made this point, maybe during the Jacasey fight, but at some time recently on commentary, he was correctly pointing out that the UK has really, really caught up to that element of the game. But as
and it's not, and the thing is that it's not really alone.
No, exactly. We were looking at the distribution of current champions, and it's still largely an American-dominated UFC, at the very least, which is no surprise because the biggest promotion in the sport started in the U.S. and is in the U.S. most of the time. And then, of course, there are still Brazilians. There have always been Brazilians. But if you look at the recent lineages of the titles, you see a pretty vast distribution of parts of the world that recent champions have come from. We have 3 fighters that are either... Yeah, actually 3 current champions are part of the Nigerian diaspora, right?
Yep. At least, many of the... So, I mean, many of them are technically like nationalized citizens of other places.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely.
We have a shitload of Russians, and we have a shitload of people from Caucasian Russian satellite states. We have a lot of Dagestanis, a lot of Chechens. We have an increasing number of fighters from Central Asia as well. You know, we've got, of course, the greatest, most beautiful fighter on the roster, Valentina Shevchenko. But there's some other notable ones as well. I mean, does Pyotr Yan count? That guy is from fucking Siberia. He's not really from like Russia, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
He's from a place where you know, it's like forest tundra. Who else in our recent?
I mean, there's Brandon Moreno, who was basically, weight belt is passed back and forth between him and Davison, but he's the first real Mexican UFC champion.
Yep.
Max Holloway, I guess, from Hawaii. But Whitaker was from Australia. So yeah, I mean, there's just
Australia and New Zealand are another region, by the way. Part of, I guess, what we would call the UK diaspora, where they inherited their forefathers' disdain for wrestling, and even more so. In the UK, it was boxing. Of course, there's many great boxers from Australia, but these states are also in parts of the world where there are many converging kickboxing cultures and lots of ways to compete in kickboxing. So for a long time, if you were an MMA fighter from Australia or New Zealand, it was like being an MMA fighter from France. Like, okay, so you've done Muay Thai. That's not the case anymore. Volkanovski is now not the only guy from that part of the world who can crush people with his wrestling, who is better than competent at the wrestling aspect of the game. Yeah, yep. And we have guys like Ngannou is from Cameroon.
Cameroon, yep. We had Jan Blachowicz from Poland, and there's a solid chance that we will have Jiri Prochazka from the Czech Republic.
Oh, right, yeah. We had Joanna as well, another Polish champion. We have had Zhang Weili from China. Mm-hmm. We have Song Yadong from China, a very promising up-and-comer who is shockingly still 24 years old. He's honestly one of the youngest fighters in the entire promotion. Where the average age is really about like 33 across all the divisions.
And as you said before we started recording, he has been through basically 2 entire like development arcs whilst we've seen him in the UFC.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it, is that these two things are tied together. We have a super wide, increasingly international talent pool in MMA. And that is both because of this sort of like dissemination of what I called like the basic MMA package. But it also, I think, feeds back into it. We now have influences coming from a wider array of areas, and so the basic MMA package is just becoming more and more well-rounded.
So we can also tie I think we can tie another point that we were mentioning, and related to the Song Yadong point. Everyone in all the UFC divisions is now kind of old.
Yeah.
So we were looking at this, like the average age of a signed UFC fighter, at least again in the men's divisions, because again it's easier to compare and all that kind of stuff. There's surprisingly little. So the age curve is essentially what you'd expect. Mm-hmm. The oldest ones are at heavyweight, the youngest ones are at flyweight. the curve is much less than you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
The oldest, at heavyweight, the average age is 33.8, so basically about 34. And at flyweight, the average age is 29 and a half. So there's a bit, basically around 4.5 years between flyweight and heavyweight, which is really not necessarily what you would expect.
Yeah. And there are like 3 or 4 divisions where it's 32, right? Like 32 is probably the average age of current.
Pretty much
UFC
everything
fighters.
is around, 31, 32.
Mm-hmm.
Even, you would be surprised. Light heavyweight is not actually that old. Light heavyweight is 32. Middleweight is 32.
That is as shocking as Howley Paiva's age to me.
Nothing's as shocking as Howley Paiva's age to me. Sorry.
I'll never be shocked again after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's a UFC specific thing, obviously. I don't think you could possibly say that MMA is getting older.
I will say, the first time I see one of those guys who looks like him, and I find out that they were born in the 21st century, I will literally crumble into dust like someone at the end of an Indiana Jones film.
Just evaporate.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, so what I was going to tie this back to is the fact that the general age of fighters in the UFC is also indicating something to us, which you kind of called out before we started the show, which is that the UFC now really goes out of its way to get finished products.
Yeah.
And one of the things about so it will generally, through either its scouting process, it will try for regional champions. And I think this is actually why the heavyweight division is not vastly older than the rest. Is that this is the only division where they don't do this, but they will get established champions from regional organizations, or they will run people through the Contender Series, which is broadly often the same thing.
Yeah.
And so they will ensure that when people get there, they have like minimum 6 or 7 years of MMA experience.
Yep.
And that they know that they are like good.
As opposed to like tough, where you would occasionally get guys who had literally never fought pro.
Mm-hmm.
And you would get plenty of
like
people
Alex
with
Caceres and so on, or Matt Mitrione, or
with 5 fights or 2, 3, 4, less than 10 fights on their records.
Yeah, I think potentially did Matt Mitrione literally have 0 fights?
He may have. Yeah, I don't think he was. I don't think he was the only one. I think there have been a couple who have literally just not even fought pro before. So this raises a point that I have to mention. It's very likely that our perspective of how the sport has progressed is skewed by this factor. Mm-hmm. That we think we're seeing an increasing movement towards well-roundedness, when in fact what we may be seeing is just that MMA fighters pretty much always have to get more well-rounded over the courses of their careers. And we just aren't seeing young guys who likely still have more pronounced specialization in their games.
Well, I mean, I think it's also that if the UFC is essentially collecting off the tops of regional pyramids. I mean, it's always done that to some extent, but it's doing it at, the pyramids are more developed and they're doing it later, right? You have to not just be, say, like a Cage Warriors or an NFA champion, but you might want to have to defend it a few times. But the thing is that the more developed those pyramids become, the less likely it is that you can, the more dangerous it becomes to be specifically exploitable in some kind of way.
Right.
If you want to get to the top of the pyramid and be standing on it when the UFC swoops by and picks up everyone off it, you need to make sure that you're not vulnerable in some specific way.
This is because
there's the classic.
Go on.
One of the classic things, when we used to look at prospects coming up from UK, you could still see this to some extent. Although with Jack Shore, for example, it's very different. So you could look at him and you could be like, this is a regional grappler.
Mm-hmm.
This is someone who was evolved to capitalize on a scene where the grappling isn't great, and they'll just like prioritize wacky subs, like let's say like Paul Sass, for example.
Right.
And then they would have a bunch of highlight reel finishes. UFC would swoop round, and then they'd be like, "Welcome to the UFC, Paul Sass. Go and finish Michael Johnson."
Mm-hmm.
He did. But now, this is just to get to the top of that kind of thing. You're going to be going through a lot more people who are just good at MMA.
Yeah.
You cannot just be around a grappler or a striker and just hope that the UFC is going to get you on the basis of knocking people out, and you will have to do it for years.
Yeah, we see more of the actual the championship effect taking place in a more pronounced way in non-UFC championships, because just the talent pool is better, the competition is tougher, and also more well-rounded. And we know when people have to reign as champions, it's the ultimate kind of experience to gain, because you have to be able to deal with everything, and everybody comes in super well prepared for you. It's just the toughest ringer that you can possibly go through, that will either speed or completely stagnate your development as a fighter. And I feel like we see guys more at a lower level who have had some version of that experience before they get to the UFC. It's also because the UFC just needs to fill time slots more than ever. And more than ever, we need short notice fill-ins for those time slots, because everyone's dying and getting sick and having their visas restricted and stuff like that related to the pandemic. And so we also just see a bunch of guys who are hanging around in shape. They've had 22 fights, and they get the call and they come in. We get even weird sort of dysfunctional but still finished products like Malcolm Gordon is a guy that comes to mind, who's been fighting in the UFC lately, or Trevin Jones, and some of these guys will have at least a couple moments of really pronounced success because they're finished products. But I do think, again, it's tied to a larger thing, but this is very much a UFC business practice thing. And we should keep in mind that what we're assessing as trends might be affected by that. Although it's still fair to say that if there are a broader array of low-level championships that are forcing you into a well-rounded style, it's still headed in a general direction of everyone's got to be really well-rounded. Less pronounced specialization than we might have expected.
Yeah, I think going back to the UK for a while, kind of grappling was a cheat code for a while on the UK scene, and then if everyone puts in the cheat code, suddenly you just look around and you're like, oh, actually everyone's quite good at grappling now.
Yeah,
everyone was trying to get ahead. All they've done is just sort of generally raised the overall level.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and just competition just drives the level up. Just the level of regional. The level of regional MMA, but also, just the fact that you can get good training almost everywhere. City kickboxing in New Zealand, and wherever Volkanovski trains out of. Where is it?
Is it?
Freestyle fighting gym, I believe. That's where they're saying that he fights out of?
Something like that.
Yeah, because we have been, as many people have been, very remiss in just saying that he's just a city kickboxing guy. He only really trains there a little bit.
Yeah,
I believe he actually trains out of.
And really seems to have a camp that is very much devoted to him as a champion, which is another thing I think we are seeing more of and will continue to see more of, a growth into what has existed for a very long time in boxing, which is that fighters are not they're part of a team which exists to support them. They're not part of a team where everyone sort of tries to strike this awkward balance between this is an individual sport, but also we're loyal to each other or something, right? It's always...
Well, I'm not sure if that might be a money thing.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm not sure if the UFC has the if MMA in general. I think the UFC probably sucks up too much of the money to make that enough of a viable business model a lot of the time.
Well, yeah, the guys we're seeing doing this are in the UFC, pretty much by and large. There are a couple exceptions, people who are just super well paid, like I think Kyoji Horiguchi doesn't spend all his time at American Top Team, I don't think. I think he also has specialized camps. But yeah. So, okay, why don't we take a break here? When we come back, we should try to wrap up this discussion by talking about what we sort of project to be coming down the pike. We could briefly touch on another one of my bugbears, which is like this increasing emphasis on physical development and things like changing weight classes and getting better at cutting weight as opposed to improving skill set. It's undeniable that both of those things fighters have gotten better at both of those areas, both skill and physical training. But we can talk about how one is weighted versus the other, and then we can talk about other sort of metagame stylistic shifts that we see coming in the future after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
All right, folks, welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are, as promised, going to try to wrap up our discussion of the sort of trajectory of MMA as a sport, the UFC as a promotion, and the game as it was, as it is, as it will be. I think that's the thing to finish up on, is we can try to project, Phil, based on the developments we've seen up to this point, what we expect to come in the next 10, 20, 30 years. That's probably all we're going to get, right, of life on Earth?
Be me, for sure.
Oh, for sure. You're practically done already. So, Phil, the next 3 years, what do you think we're going to see? That's your expiration date.
I've seen a lot of MMA come and go. I can tell you that whatever comes in the next 3 years is going to be terrible. It was better when I was a lad.
Everyone used to be heavyweights.
Yeah, that was the real time. So what are we going to go see? I think the progression of just general well-roundedness, I think that's probably something that we're going to continue to see moving forward. I think the global expansion of the sport will also just drive it from much more areas. I think that's going to continue. So we're going to see. I think the interesting question in any kind of almost any kind of developmental question that people come up with, the big X factor is always Africa, right? And I guess because I think we've already seen we're already seeing sort of Chinese native Chinese fighters. Mm-hmm. Been trained in Chinese gyms. There is a Chinese MMA structure over there. Francis Ngannou is African, and to some extent, Usman and Sanya both are, but none of them were really trained in Africa.
Right.
So it will be fascinating to see if there's like more of a. I know there is. There's obviously like South African MMA and so on.
EFC, I think.
I know there are regional promotions, but it'll be. And who was the guy that we saw recently who super gritty guy that we're like worried will get burned out by being incredible action fights all the time?
An African fighter?
From? Is that
an African fighter?
Yeah.
Super gritty action guy.
David Onama. Uganda.
Oh, David Onama, yes.
Is David Onama actually trained in Uganda?
I'm going to guess no.
I am. Is that?
I'm going to guess no.
Yeah.
I don't think we've really seen much of that yet.
Yeah, so I think basically we'll see more fighters from more places. I think they're going to be more well-rounded. In terms of the technical development of the sport, I mean, is it enough to just say that people are going to get better everywhere? We're going to see more people able to jab and work in combination on the feet.
Yeah.
We're going to see more people being able to fight from and in control positions on the cage. We'll see more of the more of the cage wrestling that was mostly like pioneered by guys like Khabib, and the control positions from there being like disseminated throughout basically every level, because there's no reason why everyone can't, attack posts and wrap up the supporting arm and
right.
That's not Khabib specific. So, I think in terms of the general, it seems a super bland thing to just be like, oh yeah, everyone's just going to get better.
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of more specific areas to look into. I don't think any of that's wrong. I mean, I think it is what we have seen largely already. Certainly, striking has gotten way better. So much so. We've talked about this in the show before. Even if we don't see this becoming the striking-dominated sport that we might have expected a few years back, it's undeniable. People hit the body now. People use their jabs. People move their heads. Like, these are things that just did not exist in MMA until relatively recently. So that's cool. I think we're going to continue to see just a general improvement of technique. I think in a more specific style sense, we're probably going to continue to see more and better outfighters. I think this may be the last turn. MMA has now been for so long the thing where the guy who comes forward wins. And it doesn't have to be. In fact, it should be. On the one hand, as a sport, MMA it lends itself to that more, because having the initiative is arguably even more valuable than something like in boxing, because there's so many things you can threaten with. So just having the initiative gives you almost limitless opportunities to surprise your opponent by making them guess wrong. But MMA is fought in a big-ass, mostly circular cage with no corners. So getting out of the way should be way easier than it is in a boxing ring. This is almost certainly, in fact, part of the reason we haven't seen this area of the game develop before now, because you can just get away with worse footwork. But, shoddy, mediocre footwork isn't just going to get you trapped in the corner forever, quite as easily, because there's so much space to move around in a cage like the Octagon or like the Bellator cage, or the One cage or what have you. But because we've seen, and I do think we will continue to see, a pretty dominant form of aggressive volume striker, and sort of going hand in hand with that, the aggressive volume wrestle grappler, guys who just pressure you and run you into the fence and do what they want to do with you from there. There is a niche waiting to be filled up by people who, like that's a style. There's nothing that says that's the only way of fighting, and there are many, many ways to counter that kind of approach. There are ways to hold on to the initiative that do not involve coming forward, and there are ways to make aggressive fighters look silly that have been explored in boxing and in many other combat sports many times over. So I think it's sort of inevitable that we continue to see more outfighters. I think we're already seeing a few more of these guys as up-and-comers. Like we've talked multiple times already about Jack Shore and Bryce Mitchell. Both of them are not necessarily devoted pressure strikers on the feet when they do strike. We've got a guy like, who was the other one on the tip of my tongue? My boy Chris Gutierrez, super fun to watch. He has had to become a higher output fighter, but he is very much an evasive back foot fighter. We've got guys like Magomed Ankalaev, like Cyril Gahn.
In Israel Adesanya. I think would be someone you could definitely say he's happy to be offensive, but only if his feints are working.
Yeah, so I just think it's a natural answer. There's two ways you can respond to a guy who mashes forward. You can try to do it better than him, or you can try to expose the flaws in that approach. And it just seems very natural that we're probably on the cusp of finally seeing a real wave of people who know how to fight off the back foot, which is cool. I like that.
I'm still curious to see, we've said it before in terms of developments in the sport. I'm still curious to see if people will ever be confident enough in their defensive wrestling to use, like, teeps much.
To use
still really
teeps?
think like that's, yeah.
Yeah.
I still think that's super underused
I agree.
in the sport. I think it is pretty much just Joanne Calderwood, maybe like a few other people.
Cyril Gahn's got a good one. Yeah, there are a couple. There's certainly plenty of front kicks. But
lots of front kicks, lots of snap kicks. They got really popularized. But yeah, not a lot of like teeps to deliberately like push people. Not a lot of push kicks.
Yeah. It's a foot jab. It's basically every bit as useful and flexible as just a regular jab, just in kick form. It's an essential strike in Muay Thai, and yeah, I agree. I think we'll probably start to see it because distance is still an incredibly important thing in MMA. It's always going to be, I think, contended at a slightly longer distance on average than a boxing match because there's so much shit to worry about. You don't want to cut down your reaction time that much by standing too close. And the teep keeps people further away more effectively than any other strike. And like a jab, it can set up so many other attacks and moves.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally my kind of amateurish perspective. The main problem is that like why we don't see more of it is that you like one of the primary counter to a teep is just to sweep it out of the way, just push it to one side and then hit the other person. I mean, I guess it's, again, more of a front kick, but you see the general idea in like Rumble versus Gustafsson.
Yeah,
the classic example of like parry and then dead. But in like Muay Thai, the issue with this is that if you that kind of sweeping motion, you just round kick you, and then you're taking it on one arm. Or
you just lift the knee to get the reaction, and then you jump in with a left hook or an elbow while their hand is down trying to swat.
So I think that kind of the fact that people in MMA very rarely can throw round kicks with that kind of power, and the risk of being on one leg, I think, means that people are scared of it. But it still should be used more. Also, defense in terms of... I do find myself wondering, sort of, you and like Jack Slack in various, with varying levels of irony, have talked about like the 52 blocks, but it is notable that there's think more of a movement towards high guards and active hand defense in MMA in general.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was thinking of, Peter Yan is, for example, the most...
he's the blockingest striker in the sport.
One of the most broadly high-level MMA fighters out there at the moment, let's say.
Yeah.
I think in terms of depth of skill set everywhere, it's probably Peter Yan. Even above Volkanovski. Volkanovski has other attributes which I think possibly make him a slightly better fighter.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you were just like grappling, wrestling, defense, etc., 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 it would probably be...
Who's a guy, if you give him 15 minutes of fight to learn from, he could literally do pretty much anything legal. And some things that aren't. Ba-doom-tsh. Yeah.
Indeed.
It's Peter Yan.
Yeah. And, Mads Burnell, who we've also mentioned. These guys are definitely moving much towards... Peter Yan is someone who's able to maintain a high pace while not taking tremendous amounts of damage, which I think is very important. So I think we will probably see more of people, doing that kind of thing, taking shots off with their elbows. And Dustin Poirier as well, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Active defense using the hands and arms as well. And it's obviously it's quite complicated. I think one of the areas which is just more complicated and difficult to do than it is in boxing, because you don't have the gloves to save you. But I think that's a big area of development, one that we'll probably see soon. I think, all this is basically bringing us to one inexorable conclusion.
Yes.
Joe Rogan was right.
Joe Rogan was right. MMA natives are going to dominate the sport.
It's all specialists who need to put their hands up.
Yeah.
I was right all along, Connor.
Oh, my God.
You were wrong. Joe Rogan was right.
I will say I think that makes perfect sense as a development of the aggressive volume striker. You want to keep your hands up in a position where they can both defend and attack easily. You want to get in and stay in range all the time. It makes a lot of sense to do that. But as it is in boxing, I don't think there's a particular pressure for everyone to have a high guard. There should be. And even more so, there are even more reasons not to be tied to a high guard in MMA. There's a whole lot of shit that can hit your legs and your body. You're blocking your vision from a lot of potential risks. And underhooks.
Peter Yan does also seem to be fairly immortal to damage to the body, so
yeah,
that works for him.
It works for him. It might not work for everybody. But yeah, I definitely think that's a development along a certain stylistic track. I kind of just think what we're going to see is more of a, we're just going to be seeing what the MMA styles really are set in stone over the next couple decades. And they're probably going to have things in common with the boxing styles that I usually use to think about fighter psychology that Pat and I applied to MMA all those years ago. But they'll be different in their ways too. The MMA outfighter is going to have to be able to hit reactive takedowns as an out to thwart the pressure striker. And so what does an MMA outfighter's grappling game look like? Is there a consistent pattern there? Or are there in fact two kinds of MMA outfighters which use their grappling defense in different ways? I think we're just going to see more and more sort of ruts. I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean like wagon wheel ruts. The grooves are going to be worn deeper and deeper.
It's just optimization strategies.
Yes. Yeah. A sort of narrowing of options for each given sort of strategy in the game.
We will also see them employed unevenly. One of the things, again, we sort of talked about a bit beforehand, is that obviously trends don't hit divisions all at the same time.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
And sometimes divisions can evolve in one way and go backwards in another.
Yeah.
welterweight and, again, something we've touched on before in other episodes, welterweight and middleweight have both, in the grappling sense of the word, have pretty much gone backwards.
Yeah.
The middleweight was only a division with powerful grapplers in for a pretty short amount of time, but it was.
Mm-hmm.
It seems remarkable that, like, Anderson Silva's division, which, where, well, like, the best wrestler in this division is Chael Sonnen, and then it's, I guess it's Yushin Nagami. Suddenly it was the division with Yoel Romero and Chris Weidman and Luke Rockhold and Tim Kennedy.
And Jacare.
Like, at one point, there was a serious... And Derek Brunson. There was a serious depth of wrestling in that division, which is no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, in the GSP era, there was simply an array of rugged wrestle boxers that just don't exist anymore.
Yep. Johnny Hendricks, Josh Koscheck, Mike Pierce,
Ryan LaFleur, Ellenberger. They had different attributes, but they
Shields.
Yep.
They're all gone and being annoying online.
Yep.
This is another thing that we didn't quite get to. But there does seem to be a shift because everyone's getting bigger and there's so much more weight cutting that now for a long time welterweight was like the barrier where it's on the one hand it's the last good division. It's the last outpost of civilization before you get into the horrible wilderness of middleweight and up. On the other hand, going from the other direction, it's the last bad division. It's the boring one of the smaller weight classes, and has for a long while, as you said, been dominated by wrestlers. I think now because everyone's cutting so much weight, lightweight is the new WrestleFuck division. All the up-and-comers at lightweight, they're wrestlers. It's no longer the division where it's like every possible style under the sun, but mostly striking. Now that's featherweight and bantamweight. Especially bantamweight. All the bantamweights are lightweights of 20 years ago.
Yes, this is undeniably true.
Yeah. Those are all the guys that used to populate lightweight and made it such a fun division, which is still very fun. But now it just feels more like, 2005 welterweight. Which was a great division.
I think, partially that's also probably like a technical development. We've said, it's a skill to be able to hold people down effectively.
Yeah.
Especially at a lower weight class.
Yeah.
And that's something that served people like Demetrius Johnson or Khabib, for that matter, very well.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's just a skill which I guess is being disseminated more. It's just people are like, oh, yeah, it is actually super valuable to be able to wrestle people. And it is worth noting that, again, wrestling, even, we said that Khabib sort of exploited lightweight, but even just thinking about it, just historically, wrestling has been the cheat code in that division. Because wrestlers in that division have tended to run it, with the exception of BJ Penn.
Clayson Tebow.
I mean, just literally like Frankie Edgar and Gray Maynard.
Gray Maynard.
But also, Ben Henderson was essentially the best wrestler in lightweight division that he populated, and he's not like a particularly fantastic wrestler.
No. But he would wall and maul the shit out of people. He certainly out-wrestled the hell out of Nate Diaz when they fought, and otherwise he was competent enough to control the few wrestling moments.
He was simply better than Clay Guida.
Yeah. Boy, Ben Henderson, another guy who we just have to admit, who was just right about everything. He did the calf kicks. He was a super well-rounded fighter, a real jack-of-all-trades type of fighter. And he just had a neck that you couldn't choke out. That will continue to be a very important attribute in MMA. Last thing sort of related to that, I guess, very specific thing. I think we will continue to see more clinch wrestling. More takedowns from the clinch. More striking in the clinch. This has been an area that's been wide open to be exploited for a long time. because, as you said at the very top of this episode, people naturally fall into the clinch when they're striking. And for much of the sport's history, MMA fighters have tended to view the clinch as a bit of a rest stop, where we can sort of collect our thoughts and think for a minute. And we have seen an increasing number of young prospects and like fresh fighters freshly entering their primes who excel in clinch exchanges because they do not think of it as a place to rest. Guys like Arman Sarukian, who tie up with their opponent and are immediately securing a body lock, spinning under the arm, getting to the back, hitting sweep takedowns, trips. I just think, and there's a bit of like classic wisdom from Fyodor Emelianenko, which I think will continue to apply, which is that if a takedown is a super high risk but very high reward technique, and therefore very, very important, then a clinch takedown mitigates the risk somewhat. Because you don't have to end up getting sprawled on and then possibly having to be on the bottom. Like if a takedown, a shot takedown goes really disastrously, you might get your back taken. If a clinch takedown goes really disastrously, I mean, hopefully. I've seen plenty of people will go for like a lat drop or something and end up on bottom. But if your standard array of clinch takedowns go badly...
The classic one is obviously head nod.
Absolutely. But if your more trial-tested clinch takedowns go badly, usually you just end up still on your feet, still in a clinch. So I think we will continue to see more clinch wrestling. We've already, I think, seen a shift in that direction. But it's an important part of the takedown game that should not be ignored, and it's also a place where tons of badass striking can happen.
I mean, it's interesting, though. I mean, I can't really think of that. There still aren't really that many fighters I would describe as being good strikers and good clinch wrestlers.
Yeah. Charles Oliveira, Bryce Mitchell's pretty good in clinches. We weren't even sure how good he was as a shot wrestler until that Feely fight, I don't think.
I think Charles Oliveira might be the gold standard. Peter Yan.
Yan, absolutely.
So very good, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shout-out in every category, pretty much.
Basically. Yep. Rose Namajunas, underrated clinch wrestler. It's where she gets her takedowns when she gets them.
Unfortunately, she can't, she doesn't have the... And again, this is one of the problems with the clinch not being a rest stop. If it isn't a rest stop, you can get tired there.
Absolutely.
But, it does rely... If you're not using it as a rest stop, you have to sort of rely on having infinite cardio.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's very true. Right. I mean, it still is weird when you see, Brown just dumping people from the clinch, and you're like, oh yeah,
why isn't everyone doing this?
One does that.
Yeah. Matt Brown at 49 years old will come in and just hit a foot sweep that none of his opponents ever see coming.
Yep.
And just hit it instantly after connecting in the clinch. Yeah. Those Muay Thai instincts. Matt Brown is a hero. Joe Rogan was right, unfortunately. Well, I like Ben Henderson, so, mixed bag. Ben Henderson was right. But best of all, Matt Brown was right. I think that's the note to end on.
I think that balances out.
Yes.
Yeah. That gives us a win overall.
Matt Brown was and is right. Okay. Well, I think that sums up what I found actually to be a very interesting discussion, and perfectly, I think if I go back to the beginning of the episode and just cut out the part where we mention that
that we were going to be doing other stuff,
that we messed up, and that we shouldn't have talked about 273 last week, and then I changed last week's episode title, which at the moment I think is "We're a week early." I know. Then we can probably just pass it off as if this was somehow part of our plan. Because I enjoyed that.
100% agree.
Great. All right. Lying to the audience, our specialty. I think I'm going to wrap up here, and if we want to do a little Dern-Torres discussion, or should we just hit it really quickly? I think we have... Actually, it's very quick. Let's just mention it. Torres is going to win, right?
She should.
She should.
She does like wrestling a lot.
She likes to wrestle.
That's the bad thing. She's pretty good at it, to be fair. Pretty much no one out-wrestles Tisha Torres or out-grapples her. She got submitted by Rose Namajunas way back in the day. But then again, you shouldn't do that with Mackenzie Dern. On the flip side, Mackenzie Dern has absolutely stagnated as a developing fighter. I found her last fight against Marina Rodriguez to be quite troubling.
It was also coming after the Nina Nunez fight where she did exactly what you would hope and just charged her.
Yeah. And then she went in there and, I'm all for a fighter going in there and making the risky decision to say, I want to get some time in. I'm not necessarily going to take the easy win and win quickly. I'm going to get some time in and practice my other shit, in a sort of, live fire scenario. But then when you just basically show like zero interest in getting a fight to the ground, through much of the fight, and you're so bad at the striking part really that you like exhaust yourself so that if you did have that idea to adjust, you couldn't execute it. These are bad signs. So assuming again that we don't just get Tisha Torres taking Dern down and diving right into a submission, Torres is just like, she's like the John Dodson of her division. She's just very solid. She's quick. She hits reasonably hard. She moves around a lot. And she's well-rounded and difficult to out-wrestle. So, like, she's just continues to be a stalwart test for any opponent. And I don't think Dern is really yet up to the task of taking out, like, actually good athletes with well-rounded skill sets.
I will say, Torres is actually, like, underratedly violent as well.
Yeah. She's had moments
of really got a
like John Dodson.
Bad rappers. John Dodson wasn't underratedly violent. He people all the time. But she clearly does hurt people when she hits them. I mean, especially nowadays. Yeah. She sits on her shots and throws in combination and she's small, but she's quite physically strong. And she hurts people. I think part of the reason why Mackenzie Dern didn't try and clinch up with Rodriguez is that she was getting hurt a lot.
Yeah.
And I think Torres actually can scare her.
Probably.
Maybe she'll just, insist on shooting for the takedowns as she always does. And just get locked up in the clinch with someone who's much bigger than her. But it's entirely possible, but I do think that, like, largely she's just going to tool Dern on the feet. She
does have to do the actual hard work of scaring Dern first, though, not having the advantage of just being way bigger than her, which I think also played a role in freaking Dern out on the feet. If every fighter is at least a little bit of a bully, it just feels intrinsically better to be fighting a little dynamo like Tisha Torres, standing across from her and being able to look down on her, than it does to be staring up at Marina Rodriguez. So psychologically, Torres might be in a close fight, but the longer it goes on, provided she doesn't make any critical errors, it just feels like a very winnable matchup for her. And that's it for this week's Heavy Hands. Again, I enjoyed that discussion. Topic episodes always fill me with a sense of calm, relaxation, and I want to thank you, Phil. I want to thank you by telling people to harass you on Twitter at Evil Greg Jackson. Phil has some very aggressive opinions. He does not care about representation. He's frankly a monster. And at Evil Greg Jackson, again, at Evil Greg Jackson. And make sure you spell the evil part correctly. That is the most important part. You can find me at Boxing Bush, BUSCH. And check out our Patreon. And we'll talk to you next week when I almost did it again. I was almost like, well, this is the 273 episode. So next week we're going to get to recap 273, right?
I am only hoping that we are right this time.
Great. Okay, well, we'll talk to you about that or something else then. Until then, if you came here today for the Final Points of Face Punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.
don't think anyone noticed. I think we were just smooth enough. They bought it. It was all part of the plan.